Welcome to Fractured Chaos.
Hi, I'm Willow. And before you ask, yes, like the tree. My mother thought it sounded graceful and flowing. What she got instead was a daughter who bends but never breaks, and when pushed too far, snaps back with the force of a hurricane. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you this story. Maybe you think I'm looking for sympathy or trying to justify what I did. I'm not. I'm telling you because what happened at my sister's wedding 3 weeks ago has become the stuff of family legend. And honestly, I'm proud of it. See, some people are born to be the supporting character in someone else's story. They smile, they nod, they play their part and fade into the background. That's never been me. I've always been the one who colors outside the lines, who asks uncomfortable questions, who shows up wearing exactly what I want to wear. And my sister Kennedy? She spent 26 years trying to erase me from the picture entirely. Let me paint you the scene of our childhood. Kennedy is 3 years older, which in sibling years might as well be a lifetime. She was the golden child, straight A's, head cheerleader, the kind of daughter who brought home boys that made our mother swoon and our father clean his shotgun. Me? I was the aftermath, the tornado that followed in her wake, picking up the pieces she left behind and rearranging them into something entirely different. When Kennedy's porcelain doll collection mysteriously ended up having a tea party in the backyard sandbox, somehow that was my fault. Never mind that I was 5 and couldn't reach the top shelf where she kept them. When her diary went missing for 3 days, the same 3 days she'd been particularly cruel about my stutter, that was obviously my doing too. Even when her first boyfriend, Tommy Martinez, asked me to the 7th grade dance instead of her, she made it sound like I'd seduced him with some kind of prepubescent witchcraft. The pattern was set early. Kennedy was the victim, I was the villain, and everyone else just accepted it as natural law. But here's what nobody understood. I wasn't trying to steal her thunder. I was just trying to exist in the same space without being erased. Every time I achieved something, Kennedy found a way to diminish it. Got the lead in the school play? She only got it because Mrs. Henderson felt sorry for her. Made honor roll? The teachers probably gave her extra credit for being quirky. Started dating someone? He's probably just using her to get to me. By the time we were adults, I'd learned to expect it. Kennedy's wedding announcement came with the usual fanfare. Engagement photos that looked like they belonged in a magazine, a Pinterest perfect proposal story, and a guest list that read like a who's who of our hometown's social elite. And then came the bridesmaid invitation. Not a request, not even a warm gesture between sisters. Just Mom standing in my kitchen, arms crossed, saying, "Kennedy wants you in the wedding party. For appearances? For appearances, not because she loved me, not because she wanted to share her special day with her only sister, but because it would look weird if the bride's only sibling wasn't standing beside her. I should have said no. I should have saved us both the trouble and politely declined. But something in me, that stubborn, contrary part that's gotten me into trouble my whole life, perked up at the challenge. Sure, I said, I'd love to be part of Kennedy's perfect day. The next few months were a masterclass in passive aggression. Kennedy scheduled dress fittings during my work hours, sent group texts about bridesmaid duties that somehow never reached my phone, and assigned me the role of backup maid of honor, which apparently meant doing all the work with none of the recognition. But the real kicker was the dress code memo. Now, I need you to understand something about Kennedy. She's a control freak disguised as a perfectionist. Every detail of this wedding had been planned, replanned, and color coordinated down to the napkin rings. So when the bridesmaid dress guidelines landed in my inbox, I wasn't surprised to see 3 pages of specifications about fabric, hemlines, and acceptable jewelry. What I was surprised to see was the color: dusty rose, blush pink, or soft coral. Absolutely no ivory, cream, or anything that could be mistaken for white. Except that's not what the memo said when I opened it. The version I received said, ivory, cream, or soft white. Please avoid bright colors that might clash with the venue's aesthetic. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe Kennedy had sent an early draft, or her wedding planner had mixed up the versions. But when I called to clarify, Kennedy's response was illuminating. What are you talking about? I never sent anything about ivory. The memo clearly states dusty rose. Are you trying to upstage me already? That's when I realized, somewhere between Kennedy's computer and my inbox, the message had been adjusted, and I had a pretty good idea who was responsible. 2 weeks before the wedding, I did something I'm not particularly proud of. I went through Kennedy's phone. Don't judge me, she'd left it on my kitchen counter during one of her emergency bridesmaid meetings. Translation, her coming over to criticize my nail polish choices. And when it buzzed with a text from her maid of honor, Bethany, I couldn't help but glance. What I saw made my stomach drop. Did you send W the fake color memo? Yes. She'll show up in ivory and look like she's trying to steal your spotlight. Then you can kick her out and look justified. Perfect. She'll never see it coming. I stared at that screen for a full minute, watching my sister plot my humiliation with military precision. This wasn't just about keeping me in line. This was about creating a scene that would finally give her the excuse to cut me out of her life entirely. But here's the thing about being underestimated your whole life. People forget that you're not actually stupid. Naive, maybe. Impulsive, definitely. But not stupid. If Kennedy wanted a villain, I'd give her one. I went shopping that afternoon. Not for a dusty rose dress. I already had that hanging in my closet, tags still on, purchased the day after I got the real memo from her other bridesmaids. No, I went shopping for something else entirely. A +1, Declan Murphy. 6'2", dark hair, the kind of cheekbones that belonged in a cologne ad. We dated briefly in college, one of those relationships that burns bright and fast before settling into a comfortable friendship. He was working in the city now, doing something with renewable energy that paid well enough for him to wear designer suits and drive a car that didn't make embarrassing noises. More importantly, he was Kennedy's high school obsession. Not boyfriend, obsession. The kind where she'd accidentally show up at every party he attended, memorize his class schedule, and write Mrs. Kennedy Murphy in the margins of her notebooks. He never noticed her, not in that way, but she never got over him. I need a favor, I told him over lunch. Remember my sister Kennedy? She's getting married, and I need a date who'll make her nostalgic. Declan raised an eyebrow. Nostalgic or homicidal? Probably both. He laughed. You know I'm not one for drama, Willow. I'm not asking you to create drama. I'm asking you to exist in the same room as my sister while looking devastatingly handsome. Can you handle that? I suppose I could suffer through an open bar and free dinner. What I didn't tell him was about the ring. 3 days before the wedding, I did something that surprised even me. I bought myself an engagement ring. Not because I was planning to propose to myself, but because I knew Kennedy. I knew she'd spend the entire reception watching me, waiting for me to slip up, to give her ammunition for the post-wedding character assassination she was already planning. But if I showed up with a ring, a gorgeous, sparkling, impossible-to-ignore ring, it would shift the entire narrative. Suddenly, I wouldn't be the desperate single sister trying to steal her thunder. I'd be the happily engaged woman who was too busy planning her own future to care about upstaging anyone. The ring was perfect. Vintage Art Deco setting, emerald-cut diamond, the kind of piece that catches light from across a crowded room. It cost more than my car, but I figured it was an investment in psychological warfare. I just hadn't counted on Declan being quite so committed to the performance. The night before the wedding, Kennedy was wound tighter than a Swiss watch. Every detail had to be perfect. Every conversation had to be monitored. Every potential disaster had to be prevented before it could materialize. She'd seated me at the family table, but as far from the bridal party as possible. A clear message: you're here because you have to be, not because you're wanted. Declan, however, she'd placed strategically close to herself. Not next to her, that would have been too obvious, but close enough that she could watch him, study him, remember what it felt like to want something she couldn't have. You clean up nice, Murphy, Kennedy said when we arrived, her voice carrying just enough flirtation to make her fiancé, Brad, shift uncomfortably. Thanks, Ken. You look beautiful. Brad's a lucky guy. The casual use of her high school nickname, the one only her closest friends had ever used, made Kennedy's cheeks flush pink. For a moment, she looked 16 again, hopeful and vulnerable and desperately trying to be noticed. Then she caught herself, straightened her shoulders, and turned that laser focus on me. Willow, I love your dress. Very appropriate. I was wearing the dusty rose bridesmaid dress, perfectly tailored, completely within the bounds of wedding guest etiquette. Nothing she could criticize without looking petty. Thank you. I wanted to make sure I followed your guidelines exactly. Oh, did you get my memo? I wasn't sure it went through properly. The trap. She was giving me the opening to hang myself, to mention the ivory dress I was supposed to be wearing, to walk right into her ambush. Instead, I smiled. Every word, crystal clear. Kennedy's expression flickered, just for a second, with something that might have been disappointment. That's when Declan leaned over and whispered something in my ear, something innocent about the wine selection, but intimate enough that several people noticed, including Kennedy. Are you two? She started to ask. We're figuring it out, I said, letting my hand rest on Declan's arm. You know how it is. But Kennedy didn't know how it was. Kennedy had never had a relationship that wasn't immediately defined, categorized, and broadcast to everyone she knew. The ambiguity was killing her. For the rest of the dinner, I watched her watch us. Every shared laugh, every casual touch, every moment of connection between Declan and me was like a small knife being twisted in an old wound. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Kennedy's wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Riverside Manor, a restored Victorian mansion that charged premium prices for Instagram-worthy backdrops. Everything was white and gold and absolutely pristine, the kind of fairy tale setting that Kennedy had dreamed about since she was 7 years old. I arrived early for photos, wearing my dusty rose dress and the biggest smile I could muster. Kennedy looked genuinely beautiful in her gown, a sweetheart neckline with delicate lace sleeves and a train that seemed to go on forever. For a moment, standing there in the bridal suite, watching her adjust her veil in the mirror, I remembered why I'd loved her once upon a time. Then Bethany, the maid of honor, walked in. "Willow, you look nice, very pink." The way she said it, like pink was some kind of consolation prize, reminded me exactly where I stood in this particular hierarchy. "Thank you. You look lovely too, Bethany. That shade of dusty rose is perfect on you." Bethany's smile faltered slightly. She'd expected me to be wearing ivory, expected to have the ammunition for Kennedy's planned meltdown. Without it, she looked almost disappointed. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Kennedy had chosen traditional vows, the kind that promised love and honor and cherishing until death do us part. Brad looked genuinely happy, genuinely in love, genuinely oblivious to the undercurrents of tension running through the wedding party. I stood in my designated spot, held my bouquet at the correct angle, and smiled on cue, the perfect bridesmaid playing her part flawlessly. Until the officiant reached that moment, the one that's mostly ceremonial, mostly ignored, but still part of the traditional service. If anyone has reason these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. In most weddings, this is followed by silence, maybe a nervous giggle from someone in the back, a brief pause before moving on to the good part. But Kennedy turned her head. Slowly, deliberately, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were bright with challenge, with the absolute certainty that I was going to do something to ruin her moment. She was practically daring me to object, to give her the excuse she'd been building toward for months. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3. I smiled back at her, serene and supportive, and completely, utterly silent. Kennedy's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, relief, and then something that looked almost like disappointment, as if my good behavior had somehow stolen her thunder more effectively than any tantrum could have. The officiant cleared his throat and continued. "Brad, do you take Kennedy?" That's when Declan stood up. "I need you to understand, this wasn't planned. At least not by me." Declan later told me he'd been carrying the ring for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Not my ring. The Art Deco piece was safely tucked away in my jewelry box at home. This was something else entirely, a simple solitaire, elegant and classic, and completely unexpected. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chapel. "I know this isn't the time or place, but I can't wait another minute." He dropped to one knee right there in the aisle, 3 rows back from the altar, while Kennedy and Brad stood frozen at the front. "Willow," he said, and his voice was steady despite the fact that 200 people were staring at him. "I've been thinking about what you said at lunch last week, about taking chances, about not letting fear make our decisions for us. I've been afraid for a long time, afraid of screwing this up, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of all the ways this could go wrong. But I'm more afraid of letting you walk away again." I stared at him completely stunned. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't psychological warfare or strategic positioning. This was real. "I love you," he continued. "I've loved you since college, and I was an idiot for letting you go the first time. I don't want to be an idiot twice. Will you marry me?" The ring box sat open in his hand, catching the light from the stained glass windows. Around us, the chapel was so quiet you could hear people breathing. And Kennedy? Kennedy was staring at us with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, though that would come later. Not betrayal, though that was there too. What I saw on my sister's face in that moment was pure, devastating heartbreak. Because this wasn't about her wedding anymore. This wasn't about her perfect day or her carefully orchestrated celebration. This had become about the one thing she'd wanted most and never been able to have. Declan Murphy, on his knees, offering forever to someone else. Yes, I said, and meant it. What followed was chaos. Kennedy screamed, not shouted, not exclaimed, screamed, like something vital had been torn out of her chest. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling and seemed to hang in the air long after she'd run out of breath. "You planned this," she shrieked, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You selfish, manipulative—" "Kennedy," Brad said quietly, reaching for her arm. She whirled on him. "Don't touch me. Don't you see what she's doing? She's ruining everything. She's always ruining everything." Guests were murmuring now. Phones were coming out, and Kennedy's perfect wedding was rapidly becoming a social media disaster. Grandma Murphy had her hand pressed to her chest like she might be having palpitations. The flower girl was crying. And through it all, Declan was still kneeling in the aisle, waiting for me to take his hand. I did. The ring fit perfectly. "I think," said the officiant, a man who'd clearly never dealt with this particular situation before, "perhaps we should take a short recess." But Kennedy wasn't done. No, we're finishing this. We're finishing my wedding. She doesn't get to." That's when the real chaos started. Because at exactly 3:47 p.m., while Kennedy was in the middle of her meltdown, the doors to the chapel opened, and a very confused group of people walked in carrying balloons and a banner that read, "Welcome to the world, baby Emma." Here's where the story gets really interesting, because it turns out Bethany had been even busier than I'd realized. The Riverside Manor had been booked solid for months. Kennedy had reserved it almost a year in advance, paid the premium weekend rate, done everything by the book. But Bethany, in her infinite wisdom, had decided that wasn't dramatic enough. She'd wanted Kennedy to have a meltdown. Not just any meltdown, a spectacular, relationship-ending, family-destroying meltdown that would finally justify years of talking about her difficult sister-in-law. And what better way to ensure maximum chaos than to create a situation where I would definitely, absolutely ruin the wedding? The fake color memo was just the beginning. Bethany had also called the venue that morning and, impersonating Kennedy, requested that they squeeze in a small baby shower in the same space. Just a little overlap, she'd said. The bride was hoping to multitask, maybe introduce some family friends to each other. The venue manager, understandably confused but unwilling to argue with the bride on her wedding day, had agreed to the double booking. So while Kennedy was having her breakdown about my engagement, 25 people in pastel outfits were setting up gift tables and wondering why there was a wedding in progress. "Excuse me," said a woman in a yellow sundress, approaching the altar with a confused smile. "Are we in the right place? The Hendersons' baby shower?" Kennedy's face went through several colors I didn't know human faces could turn. "Get out!" she screamed. "Get out, get out, get out!" The woman in yellow backed away quickly, but not before several people had started taking pictures. That's when I realized that Kennedy wasn't just having a meltdown about my engagement. She was having a meltdown about losing control of her entire narrative. The perfect wedding, the perfect day, the perfect sister who finally knew her place. All of it was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Here's what I should have done. I should have taken Kennedy aside, explained about the memo, about Bethany's manipulation, about the fact that none of this was actually my fault. But here's what I did instead. I watched. I watched my sister, who had spent 26 years blaming me for everything that went wrong in her life, finally face the consequences of surrounding herself with people who enabled her worst impulses. I watched Brad, who'd been looking increasingly uncomfortable throughout the entire engagement, finally see Kennedy the way the rest of us had always seen her, not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone who created chaos and then played the martyr when it inevitably exploded. And I watched Bethany, realizing that her plan had worked too well, tried desperately to calm Kennedy down while simultaneously trying to delete the evidence of her involvement from her phone. "Kennedy," I said finally, when the screaming had died down to angry sobbing. "I think we need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," she spat. "You've ruined everything, again." "Actually," said Brad, and his voice was so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear him, "I think maybe we should postpone this." Kennedy's head snapped around to stare at her fiancé. "What?" "This," he gestured at the chaos around us, the confused baby shower guests, the murmuring wedding guests, the phones recording everything. "All of this. This isn't what I signed up for." And that's when Kennedy finally broke. What came out of Kennedy in the next 10 minutes was 26 years of resentment, jealousy, and carefully buried truths. She talked about how I'd always been Mom's favorite, how I'd gotten away with everything while she'd had to be perfect. She talked about feeling invisible whenever I was around, about how I made everything about myself without even trying. But most importantly, she talked about Declan. I wrote him letters. She sobbed, mascara streaming down her cheeks. In high school, I wrote him letters every week for 2 years. Love letters. And I never sent them because I was too scared. And then you just waltzed in and dated him like it was nothing. Like you didn't even care. Kennedy, I said gently, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know. You never know. You just take whatever you want and assume everyone else will clean up the mess. And there it was, the real source of everything. Not jealousy over achievements or attention or even the wedding day itself. Kennedy was still 17 years old, still staring at the boy she'd never been brave enough to talk to, watching her little sister live the life she'd been too afraid to reach for. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. I'm sorry you felt that way. I'm sorry I never knew. Sorry doesn't fix anything, Kennedy said. But some of the fight had gone out of her voice. No, I agreed, it doesn't. Kennedy and Brad didn't get married that day. They did eventually, 3 months later, in a small ceremony with immediate family only. No bridesmaids, no drama, no chaos. Just two people who'd learned something about communication and honesty and the difference between wanting a wedding and wanting a marriage. Bethany was not invited. Declan and I, we're taking it slow. The proposal was real, the feelings are real, but we're both old enough to know that grand gestures and perfect moments don't automatically translate to perfect relationships. We're figuring it out together, without an audience, without drama, without the need to prove anything to anyone else. But Kennedy was right about one thing. I don't do crawling. I don't apologize for existing, for taking up space, for living my life in a way that sometimes makes other people uncomfortable. I spent too many years trying to make myself smaller, trying to fit into the role Kennedy assigned me, trying to be the supporting character in someone else's story. That day at the wedding, watching my sister's perfect facade crumble, seeing the truth behind all those years of blame and resentment, I realized something important. I'm not responsible for other people's happiness. I'm not responsible for managing their expectations or protecting their feelings or making sure they never have to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. I'm just responsible for being myself, authentically, unapologetically, completely myself. And if that makes me the villain in someone else's story, well, at least I'm an interesting villain. Kennedy and I talk now, not often, and not about anything too deep. But we talk. She's in therapy, working through some of the issues that made her wedding day such a disaster. I'm proud of her for that. It takes courage to examine your own behavior and admit when you've been wrong. She apologized eventually for the memo, for the years of blame, for making me feel like I was always one mistake away from being cut out of the family entirely. It wasn't a perfect apology, and it didn't erase all the hurt, but it was a start. And me? I'm learning to forgive. Not just Kennedy, but myself. For all the times I let her make me feel guilty for being who I am. For all the years I spent wondering if maybe she was right, maybe I was selfish and dramatic and too much for the people around me. I'm not too much. I'm exactly enough. The wedding video, by the way, went viral. Someone posted a clip of Kennedy's meltdown and Declan's proposal, and it ended up with 3 million views and its own hashtag, #WillowWedding. Most of the comments were supportive of me, which Kennedy did not appreciate. But here's the thing that surprised me most. I don't actually enjoy being the center of that kind of attention. The schadenfreude, the picking sides, the way strangers felt entitled to judge our family drama based on a 30-second clip, none of it felt good. What felt good was finally telling my own story, in my own words, without having to apologize for any of it. So that's what happened at my sister's wedding. That's how I went from being the blamed to being the blamed and not caring about it anymore. And if you're wondering whether I'd do it all again, knowing what I know now, ask me again in a year when Declan and I have our own wedding to plan. Something tells me it's going to be much more interesting than Kennedy's ever was.